Yogurt, sodas, baked goods, chewing gum, toothpaste, canned fruits, salad dressings, lip gloss, medications, jams, and get this, meat. Woo! That was an unnecessary amount of excitement. Diet foods, diet drinks, 0 calories, no sugar, sugar-free, whatever the label, they always taste just a little funny. All of that stuff is brought to you by the noble work of artificial sweeteners. Serious question. Well, probably not that serious. Do you lick things you're unsure of? Every single artificial sweetener that came to be about was invented by accident. No kidding, like some super smart chemistry person doing chemistry stuff trying to make one thing and ends up getting some substance or powder on their fingers and licks it like Cheeto dust. Like, scientists out here mad childish. With this stuff being in over 23,000 products worldwide, what are they? Do they act like sugar in the body? Are they toxic? How do they digest? Luckily, we are on some solid ground to get some good answers because artificial sweeteners have been
scientifically scrutinized.
Welcome to No Lab Coat Required, where I out-research your doctor to learn answers to your questions, whether you're confused or just curious. My name is Johnny, and artificial sweeteners, first we have to get on the same page of what they are. They're substances, typically powdery, and they come about by high-level chemistry, and they come with a sweet taste. We have every right to be skeptical of them because they're man-made and they're kind of new. I mean, the first one was just approved by the FDA in 1970. That was like yesterday. Quick blurb about why we use artificial sweeteners instead of sugar. Sugar is great and we love it, but unfortunately, sugar is not great and we shouldn't love it. The overconsumption of sugar is a huge driver behind some of the most popular conditions to date, so avoiding it when we can is good. One of those popular conditions that we've been trying to tackle for a good minute now is obesity, and one of the levers we decided is good to pull to tackle obesity is to watch them calories, and artificial sweeteners don't give us any. Sweet taste and 0 calories? Sign me up, said the entire world. So now they are the holy grail. Artificial sweeteners are the go-to solution for, I want sugar, but I probably shouldn't have it. Now, how the heck can we eat something with empty calories? I'll explain how that works in a bit. Another thing that we have to all understand is that all artificial sweeteners aren't the same. Each one does something different in the body. Be on the lookout for these names. I'd grab a product you use or consume and see if you can spot any. We're gonna get into the weeds of every single one. But first, we have to shave a little off the top. We're all wondering, where does stevia play into this, and which one of these is Splenda? The stevia plant is native to South America and has been used as a sweetener for many, many years. It's been used for many, many moons. I'm gonna start saying that. It's the only sweetener in the conversation that technically isn't artificial, so that's why it confuses a lot of folks. But the reason it's in the conversation in the first place is because of the stuff that we extract from the leaf, stevioglycosides, which provide no calories. This is often the stuff that companies go for when they want to market their product as all natural. Now, if you don't want none of that pansy real stuff and you want your some artificial chemical-based man-made put your foot in it type of sweetener, you're gonna go to Walmart and grab you some Sweet and Low or some Splenda. Splenda uses sucralose, Sweet and Low uses saccharin. All right, now that we are all organized, are artificial sweeteners basically sugar in disguise? It's important to note that when we're talking about these artificial sweeteners, we're not talking about a large quantity that's actually used in the product, because they are 200 to 20,000 times sweeter than table sugar. 20,000! So if you and I want to make a product that usually takes about 25 grams of sugar, but we don't want to use sugar, then we can use acesulfame potassium, also known as ACE-K. At 200 times sweeter, we only need 0.12 grams. If we want to use Advantame, the new kid on the block approved for use in 2014, at 20,000 times sweeter, we'd only need 0.0012 grams. With all that sweetness packing all that punch, something's gotta be happening the moment it touches our tongue, right? Cephalic phase, defined as the commencement of the digestive process, involves food association, visualization, or olfaction, memory, mood, emotions, associations, and hedonics all play a part. That's a lot, but this is a very powerful definition. The cephalic phase is about everything about eating that doesn't regard digestion or absorption. We're talking about getting home after a long day and there's this switch that turns on and makes you want to go in the kitchen for a snack out of habit and not necessity. We're talking about when your mouth begins to water when you open a box of pizza, chewing gum and becoming hungry. Processes that take place before we actually absorb the food. But specifically in this case, we're talking about the response of the body the moment something sweet hits the tongue. This is arguably the #1 concern about artificial sweeteners. Does our body just respond as if they're sugar? This study here says exposure to sweet tasting sugars right at the tongue can trigger the release of insulin in order to lower blood glucose. Okay, pause. What does that mean? Why would the body want to lower blood glucose when we sense something sweet? The same reason you would move all of your clothes to the side in the closet because you bought some new clothes. Out with the old, or in this case, move the old to the side, in with the new. Our concern is that artificial sweeteners lead us on with the sweet taste, but it's not followed up with sugar, and the body's just like producing insulin for no reason. That'd be like your phone vibrating, you go to check it, and you ain't got nan text, nan call, not even an email. So why does this matter? Let's talk about the scope of what's going on here. Think about everyone's main concern about insulin. It stimulates fat creation. But in this case, there are no calories and there is no sugar in artificial sweeteners. So what are we making the fat out of? I mean, other than the food that's accompanying the artificial sweetener, we don't make any fat out of them. The bigger problem is the lock on fat stores that insulin creates, which inhibits the usage of the fat that we already have. Just like filling a balloon with air, the pump puts air in the balloon, but the nozzle also acts like a lock so that air doesn't escape. Honestly, this is just one not good mechanism of too much unnecessary insulin in the blood. Like, you don't want insulin just swimming around in the blood for no apparent reason. It ain't good by any stretch of the imagination. It ain't good for you, your auntie, your neighbor. It ain't it. Now let's get into what some of the science says on the matter. You are not a dummy. Specifically, your body is not a dummy. Our body has specific nutrient-dependent responses, basically meaning that artificial sweeteners ain't touching sugar because sugar can actually walk the talk. Artificial sweeteners, they just talking. This study took 5 healthy men and gave them plain water mixed with either glucose, maltodextrin, which is just a powdery sugar-like substance with no taste, or aspartame, all on separate occasions, and found that unlike the others, aspartame water mix didn't budge blood insulin concentration. This study also took 5 healthy men under very similar conditions, nearly an identical study, also used aspartame, and they had the same findings. But wait till you get a load of the third one. Researchers took about 16 folks and instructed them to have aspartame, saccharin, table sugar, and apple pie. But wait. You can't swallow it. Play with it a little bit in your mouth and then spit it out. This study was kind of the ultimate test to see if sweet taste alone can really influence insulin. Here's the results. Aspartame didn't budge insulin levels, saccharin didn't budge insulin levels, and surprisingly, table sugar didn't budge insulin levels. The apple pie, however, actually made the body produce insulin. From these 3 studies, we can probably infer that sweet taste alone isn't gonna really do the trick. But doing the swish and spit method with glucose did the trick in this study. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I have no idea why glucose alone seems to influence insulin levels, but table sugar doesn't, seeing that table sugar is just glucose plus fructose and it doesn't have the same effect. I got nothing. I mean, if you got anything, I'd love to hear it. But we do know that increasing the complexity of the food stimulus maximizes the response, which is why the apple pie worked, because it came with visual and olfactory stimuli. In other words, if you just taste it, it's probably not going to really do the trick, but if you see it, smell it, and taste it, then we're talking a proper cephalic response, i.e. insulin. But what about after we swallow? Well, here's the you learn something new every day fact. Our mouth isn't the only place where we can detect sweetness. We can also detect it in our small intestine. And we know very little about how that actually interplays with our insulin response. But this study nodded to the sweet detectors in the small intestine as the potential reason behind why consumption of sucralose decreases our insulin sensitivity. Hold up. What does insulin sensitivity mean? When we eat, sugar enters the blood, insulin is then triggered. Insulin's job is to take sugar, glucose, out of the blood and put it in its place. That can be fat cells, that can be muscle, that can be even the liver. In a healthy individual, fat cells, muscle, and the liver are very receptive to insulin, meaning when insulin is talking, they're listening. It's only when insulin is overproduced that they stop listening, and that is when we get the condition of insulin resistance, aka decreased insulin sensitivity. In that study, they took about 60 folks. Half of them were instructed to take Splenda, which is the popular sucralose artificial sweetener, 3 times a day for 14 days, and the other half were a control group, so they had no instructions. They were measured before and after, and the researchers found sucralose to decrease insulin sensitivity. This is sad. Researchers in a similar study of obese folks also ran into the same conclusion. Sucralose raised insulin levels and decreased insulin sensitivity. Now, it's important to note that these studies aren't saying that folks are insulin resistant necessarily. That's a whole condition within itself. They're just saying that sucralose does indeed affect insulin levels and thus kind of acting like sugar. And right now, the best thing it seems we could tag that conclusion to is the sweet taste detected after we swallow. But because I know you're conflicted, I can smell it, I'm gonna give you this meta-analysis that was performed in 2017. A meta-analysis is when a bunch of researchers compile the work of other researchers. These folks were set on finding the truth once and for all. Do artificial sweeteners straight up raise blood glucose sugar levels or not? So they set out and gathered randomized controlled trials.
The gold standard of scientific study.
These RCTs had to meet this criteria. They had to be human-based. The participants had to have had fasting hours prior to the artificial sweetener, and it had to be administered orally on its own. They came up with 29 studies. Aspartame, saccharin, stevia, and sucralose were the ones tested throughout these 29 studies, which happened to be the most popular sweeteners in the US. The researchers concluded that these artificial sweeteners were not the father. They didn't affect blood glucose. My personal synopsis opinion on all of this, if you would allow a gangster as myself to engage in such a monologue, after spending eye-drying hours of research and reading, scoping this stuff out, piecing it all together, I cannot personally confidently say that artificial sweeteners are sugar in disguise. Now, they got some weird stuff going on when they are ingested with other molecules, notably glucose. That's kind of when they are the most sugary acting, but other than that, I can't really say they're much like sugar. I mean, so that's good news so far. But the bad news is that we got to this point of the video and you may not have hit the like button yet. Shout out to those of you that did. I really appreciate that. But for those of you that didn't, you still got time. You still got time. You still got time. Nice, I no longer have taste buds.
Ah, that was hot.
Are artificial sweeteners toxic? But wait, define toxic right now. Hey Siri. Hey Siri.
My boy.
Define toxic in your own words.
Detrimental, potentially fatal to the human body by consumption. No, that's poison. By depending on the intake.
Very impressive work.
That's what HBCU's education does.
There's a field of science called toxicology. Toxicologists are responsible for the science of the effects from stuff. Because the dose makes the poison, which is why sugar wasn't a problem 100 years ago, but has become one since we started to overconsume it. Once we scrutinize stuff enough through animal studies and human studies, we make a judgment and we come up with the acceptable daily intake, also known as the ADI, which is the amount of something we could consume every single day over a lifetime and not experience considerable health risk. ADI is dependent upon body weight, so it's different from person to person. But according to the FDA, if you weighed 132 pounds, you could knock back 23 Splenda packets in a day before you'd have to worry about the ill effects of sucralose. Sucralose is about 600 times sweeter than table sugar. Neotame, the sweetener 10,000 times sweeter, also has an ADI of 23 packets. Goes to show how different in sweetness these things are, with sucralose's ADI being 5 milligrams per kilogram of weight and neotame's being 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Imagine you going trick-or-treating as a kid and you all excited, you ring the doorbell of your next house and a fully grown adult comes out and throws a sack of neotame in your basket and says, "That's sweet enough to hold you down for the next 2 Halloweens, kid." Scientists disagree about the relationships between sweeteners and lymphomas, leukemias, cancers of bladder and brain, chronic fatigue syndrome, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, autism, and systemic lupus. Artificial sweeteners are so controversial, we ain't even decide what disease to blame them on yet. How about we examine their relationship to the most popular disease known to date, cardiovascular disease. There's a fringe population of folks known as the Nutrient cohort. These are ordinary people living ordinary lives. What makes them different is that they are regularly tested and questioned. Their habits, diseases, and condition, history, a bunch of measurements are constantly collected throughout their lifetime. So anytime some researchers need a big old group to study, they can often turn to these fine folks because they have so much data on them. This study took about 103,000 Nutrient folks to see if there was an association between artificial sweeteners and cardiovascular disease. The results artificial sweeteners were associated with an increased risk. This is where most folks check out. We're not like most folks. You got to this point of the video, which tells me you want the full story. How did these researchers come to this conclusion? They found that 37% of folks in the group were consuming artificial sweeteners. These folks were viewed in their own box, and those that didn't intake artificial sweeteners were known as the non-consumer. The Nutrient Santé cohort group was founded in 2009, so the researchers already had mountains of data on these people, as well as the late data they gathered for this specific study. But wait, we gotta address the elephant in the room. How the heck can we blame artificial sweeteners as the sole thing behind cardiovascular disease when there are so many other things to consider?
Move this man!
Lab coats take care of that by making what we call adjustments. So they take into account all of the things that could possibly play into cardiovascular disease, and they mathematically adjust the results accordingly. For example, let's say that 30% of all adults who eat ice cream get a brain freeze. Well, what about the adults who have kids? They consume a little bit more ice cream than the adults who don't have kids, so naturally their risk of brain freeze is a little higher. We have to even out the playing field a bit to even out and get more accurate results. So the real result ends up being more like 25% of all adults get a brain freeze after adjusting for those adults who have children. Adjustments are arguably the only thing that give observational studies merit. Otherwise, we could blame anything on anything. So this Nutrient Santé study adjusted for age, sex, physical activity, smoking, education, family history, calories eaten, alcohol consumption, sodium, fats, fiber, fruit, veggies, meat, the whole shebang. Of the French non-consumer group, they standardized their results and reported out of 100,000 years of life, the incidence rate of cardiovascular disease was 314. In order to comprehend that a little bit better, we can also write that as 0.314 out of 100 years. In other words, if we adjust for age, sex, smoking, and all those fun things under the sun, and we ain't consuming artificial sweeteners, we can expect per 100 years of life, our risk of cardiovascular disease to be 0.31. But if we is consuming artificial sweeteners, we can expect that risk to jump up to 0.34%. That's a 0.03% increase. Researchers know when their findings aren't significant. If this increased risk we're talking about wasn't, then they wouldn't have reported it. That's just the nature of observational studies. We're not looking to really we're just looking for a little connection. The problem is, we always run away with this. When big old headlines say study found that blah blah blah, they're often reporting on an observational study, which isn't a problem, but ain't none of these writers thumbing through these numbers. Even the most well-designed, thought out, orchestrated observational studies, they still leave room for what we call residual confounding, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a lot of factors at play, my boy. Hey, Editing Johnny here. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to convey the situation of observational studies. I'm cutting out a little bit of this video because I'm not 100% satisfied with how I was going to convey them. So here it is. Observational studies are valid and they are not to be neglected. Even more important than the actual results is understanding the weight of them. For example, if we run a study and we give folks a substance and it blatantly raises disease markers, then the weight of that experiment is very heavy. If we take a population of folks and we don't give them anything, but instead observe them based on their life and their habits, then those results aren't as heavy. But because we run into the issue of ethics when we set up experiments to intervene in people's lives to test for certain disease markers, observational studies end up serving as one of the most viable options most of the time. And because of the power of residual confounding, the results are mixed to say the absolute least. But what we're about to go over next is about to be all you need to make a decision on artificial sweeteners. What happens to the literal molecule of the artificial sweetener when I consume it? Does it build up in my body? Does it affect my gut microbiota? Starting with aspartame. It gets to the small intestine and is then broken up into three things: phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and methanol. All three go into the blood as separate pieces and are used in the same fashion they'd be used coming from all the other foods they naturally occur in. Phenylalanine and aspartic acid are amino acids, building blocks of proteins, so they're going to go build something and be productive. You may see contains phenylalanine on products that contain aspartame, and this may be because individuals who suffer from the genetic disorder of phenylketonuria.
Phenylketonuria.
they have a hard time metabolizing it. Methanol is largely a waste product that we will either pee or breathe out. It's dangerous when consumed rapidly in high amounts, but rest assured your body is no slouch and is perfectly efficient at getting rid of the small amounts of methanol that we get from aspartame. And when I say small, I mean small. This study states that tomato juice gives 6 times greater methanol amounts than that derived from aspartame in Diet Cola. But to be honest, I don't know who's willingly knocking back tomato juice. Aspartame and its components do not accumulate in the body. Sucralose, what the heck is going on with this bad boy? It leaves the same way it came out. After swallowing sucralose, it gets down into the small intestine, then the large, and leaves out the rudder, unchanged. Note, if things get to the rear end, then that means they never went into the blood. But also note, for molecules that get that deep in our GI tract, they are undoubtedly influencing our gut microbiota more than the molecules that don't make it as deep, because majority of our microbiota live in the large intestines. Anyways, sometimes a small percentage of sucralose is directed to the kidneys to be peed out. And this explains how artificial sweeteners don't give us calories. Typically, once they break down and are brought into the blood by way of the small intestines, that's when they give us calories. On that note, aspartame actually provides us 4 calories per gram. However, the amount of calories it realistically provides is negligible because we use such a small amount of it. What about saccharin? Talk to me, what we got? Saccharin hits the small intestine, and typically a small amount of saccharin is pooped out unchanged. The bulk of it passes over into the blood, makes its rounds in the body, and then heads towards the kidneys to be peed out, also unchanged. Note, if a molecule does make it to the kidneys, that does mean that it was brought into the blood and did a full lap throughout the body before it was filtered out by the kidneys and then exiting. Saccharin is eliminated within the first 10 hours after swallowing it. This study found a mono-exponential decay of saccharin. What the heck does that mean? Its elimination time is dose dependent. So interestingly, the more you consume, the slower it takes to leave the body. Stevia! Where you at? What we doing? Stevia extract, known as stevioglycosides, those are the thingamahoods we're actually talking about. Thingamahoos, thingamajiggers, whatchamacallit. Once swallowed, the stevioglycosides pass through the small intestines fully intact. Gut bacteria split stevioglycosides into 2 compounds, stevio and glucose. Stevio goes to the liver to be packaged and shipped out in the urine. The glucose is either used by gut bacteria on the spot, or it's absorbed into the blood, metabolized, then breathed out. ACE K, what are you doing, my boy? ACE K is absorbed immediately in the small intestine, but it is not broken down. It makes its rounds within the blood, and then it hits the exit by way of the kidneys. ACE K spends no longer than 24 hours in our system. Neotame. Neotame also doesn't make it too far in the GI tract before it's rapidly split up. Once split, we get a version of neotame without a certain molecular bond and an itty bitty amount of methanol. Both are completely urinated out or leaving through the tail end within 72 hours. And advantame, what's the word? Advantame is brought into the small intestines after swallowing. There, it is rapidly transformed into ANS9801 acid. Now, what in the, which means absolutely nothing, right? Because we don't know what that is. What matters is where does it go and how long does it stay. Usually more than 80% of this acid heads on down to be pooped out. 4 to 23% of it is brought into the blood to travel through the body and to be peed on out. Advantame and its components are eliminated within 4 to 6 hours. Throughout the research and the literature, there seems to be this notion that if the sweetener doesn't reach the large intestine, then it doesn't affect the microbiota. I don't think I can confidently say that that's the case. And when we say microbiota, we're talking about the folks down there in our gut that are literally more influential to our health than we ever thought before. And we'll talk about that at some point in a different video. You see, our microbiota is kind of like the state of California. It has a dense population in the south, but that doesn't mean no one is living in the north. I think our gut friendlies are being impacted to some degree regardless of how far the food makes it down our intestines. The question lies in whether that impact is good or bad or neutral. Now, if you hate the thought of consuming man-made stuff, then I'd say go ahead and do away with the artificial sweeteners. If you are okay with man-made stuff and you are okay with how the body gets rid of them, then I'd say green lights for artificial sweeteners for you. Why are you going to continue eating artificial sweeteners, or why are you putting them things down? Which one are you? Comment below, let's talk about it. But I'm so happy you made it to this part. You are something else. That's it. I'm gonna get about your way.